Hi, welcome to my 15-minute presentation. I'm calling it the Getting Properly Screwed. So really, what we're talking about is, from a fine woodworking sense, I instruct a program called Studio Woodworking, which is a foundation woodworking program, but looking more towards fine woodworking. And we have to attach things, join things together, sometimes using simple fasteners like screws. And it's not nearly as straightforward as some people might think. And I'm hoping this presentation will actually help you to understand this a little better, to do a slightly better job, or inspire you to do other work, even more complicated. A little history, a little background. Screws. They really run the gamut in terms of size, length, gauge. We have a screw here you may not even be able to see with the lens I've chosen, but a number 2, screws gauges are described in numbers. So a number 2 is really about the smallest unless you're getting into watchmaking, or the little screws that they actually use to hold glasses together. This goes all the way up through 2, 4, 5, 6, and then 8, 10, and then this is a 3/16 lag screw, and that's a 1/4 inch lag screw. And lag screws now get into the neighborhood of hex heads to be used with wrenches and sockets and such. And they can, there is no end. I've seen them up to 3/4 of an inch in diameter. So the most common screws that we use in a woodworking shop or at home are 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. And looking more closely at these, they've actually color-coded the gauges so that the number of the gauge of the screw aligns with a color, which in turn tells you which screwdriver works with these screws. The number 4, the tiny one, is yellow, and that's a yellow Robertson screwdriver. Most Canadian woodworkers use Robertson drive screws. They're square heads. Some people know them as square heads. Not at all used with any regularity in the States. They refuse to kind of accept the fact that Robertsons are actually one of the best drive systems. The only way you can get Robertson screws in the States is to mail order them from a couple of small companies. So the range of colors goes yellow, green for 5, 6, red for 8 and 10, and then black for number 12s and 14s. So I've got all the appropriate screwdrivers here. So what's the deal with screwing stuff together? Where most people make their mistake is they will drive a screw between, they'll have 2 pieces of wood they want to join together, and they will just simply drive the screw through the first piece, the captive piece, into the anchor piece, or the backer. The problem with that is that the screw is displacing wood. There is some real estate involved in the gauge of the screw. That wood has to go somewhere, and generally what happens is it humps up between, like it just bulges up, it just grows, and holds pieces of wood apart. It will hold it together. This is together, but it's not tight. I can move it a little bit, and it's got a gap. And in our craft of fine woodworking, screws can actually be visible and even decorative. But at the very least, they need to hold precisely. They need to hold things flat with no gaps. And they actually, in some cases, act as your, excuse me, I just had lunch. Tastes just as good the second time. You need to have perfect bonding and pressure between, if you're going to glue a joint, and the screw can act as good a clamp as a clamp itself. So it's, in some circumstances, it's a great way to go. So it's impossible to get a screw to come down to flush on a piece of wood when you're just forcing it through. And if it does, more often than not, it's going to split the wood. There's going to be some kind of poor result if you do that. On a properly screwed together piece of wood, it will be perfectly flat. you'll show 0 gaps. The screws will be countersunk below the surface. And the principle, the simple principle that's used to do that, can be demonstrated with this. This is a little prop that I've made. It's 2 pieces of steel. It might be a material that people are more familiar with. If you were going to bolt 2 pieces of steel together, the process, the principle, is the exact same thing as you would use for wood. I've got 2 holes in this piece of steel. One of them is what is called a clearance hole. The bolt just slides through quite freely on a clearance hole. The other one is threaded for this thread pitch, as is the other. So if I want to join these together, utilizing the threaded piece of steel and trying to thread it into the other piece, which is also threaded, eventually it kind of jams. Sometimes if you get it the angle just right by spinning it, you can actually tighten it all the way to the end. But at no point are you ever going to get these 2 pieces of steel together, because the threads are actually helping them to stay apart. It's making it impossible for them to be together, in other words. So the theory then is to actually draw the anchor piece, or the captive piece, into the anchor piece. So our bolt, or in the case of a wood screw, should go through, have a clearance hole. So it slides freely, thread the bolt into the second piece. So in the case of a screw, it's the threads that are cut into the screw that bite into the anchor piece of wood, or the backing piece. And even by hand, I can tighten that up perfectly. Pretty straight ahead stuff. It's a no-brainer. It's easy to wrap your head around. But what people generally don't think about that when it comes to wood screws and holding things together with wood screws. So how do we do it with wood screws? I'll show you. There's 3 components. We have to drill what's called a countersink. So the countersink is the part in the wood where the screw head is allowed to go beyond flush. The clearance hole is the hole that allows the screw to slide freely. And then on the anchor piece, we're going to choose a drill bit. So countersink, clearance hole, so allowing the threads to move through the piece. And then the third hole is a pilot hole, which is somewhat smaller than the outside diameter of the screw. The drill size you want is meant to replace the solid shank of the screw, but yet allow the threads to bite into the side of the hole. Finding the size of your pilot bit. The pilot bit is often a little bit interesting. I don't attach numbers to these things or sizes. I do it simply like this. I grab a drill bit, I line it up in front of the screw, and I just want to see the drill bit replace that shank area in there and yet leave the threads. So here's our pilot size. So what do we do for the clearance hole? Well, we like to do things as fast as possible. So we have a combination bit that has the clearance hole that allows the screw to go through freely, which has been drilled in here. And there's a secondary component, which is our countersink, which actually allows us to countersink and do the clearance hole simultaneously. So the order, let's actually do it. I'll show you how it's done. This is a small graphic of what this looks like and what the 3 components are when 2 pieces are drawn together. I'll show close-ups of that when I edit the video. So I've got 2 cordless drills here. I'm going to put the pilot drill in first. Just check the depth. Looks good. I'm going to mark where I want my screw holes. I don't have a clock in here, so I actually haven't been keeping track of the time. So I'll try to get this done within 15 minutes. So I've just drawn a line, and I want to put 2 screws in here. I'm going to hold this piece of wood together where I want it. So what this is doing is it's giving me the final pilot hole and a location to draw my clearance and countersink, which we're going to use this bit right here. So in the anchor piece, the piece to be screwed down, so here's a little trick. So that's the outside of our joint. The screw's going to go down through there and screw this piece onto this anchor piece. But to absolutely guarantee that it's going to come down tight and perfect, we flare the backside of the clearance hole. So just while the combination bit is in the drill, we just slightly arris or flare this backside. And what that does is it gives, when the threads of the screw go into the anchor piece, they will still mushroom up a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. And you really want this to go together perfectly. So if we just remove the area that flaring up of wood would go, it's absolutely guaranteed to go together tight. So I've got a number 8 screw, super common dimension. I'm just going to move, because our lights go off with an automatic sensor. There we go. So now I've got 2 screws just started. I'll just drive them by hand. They go in quite well. The trick with the pilot hole is that you want to have enough of a bite with the thread, so a small enough hole, but not so small that it could potentially crack the wood. Now, the variety there is an extremely hardwood, like ebony, eastern maple, rosewood. You would want to have a slightly larger than average pilot hole, because that wood's so hard, you really need to have less threads catching, because it can, even with that pilot hole, the screw can go in very hard. It's hard to put in, and if you're using a screw gun or a drill to put your screws in, you can actually twist them off. So you want to make your pilot holes a little bit bigger. So this is done. It's absolutely tight and 0 gaps, and if that had glue in it, in 30 minutes, that's a forever joint, forever and ever. Now, one additional thing that we commonly do is when we countersink and set the screw down a fair distance, like 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch, we make these little plugs, wooden plugs, out of the matching wood or contrasting wood. We make the little plugs in a drill press with a cutter, break them off, put a little glue in here, tap them in, pair them off with a chisel, sand it flush. You can't even tell you use screws. It's a perfect job. So, other than that, the only tip I would give you is when you're using your cordless drill, and this is a nice cordless drill, but even a cheap one, they all come with a clutch, and that's that sound. So right here is an adjustment. If you have it on one, you barely have to hold this, and nothing's turning. So what that means is, if I was to drive a screw, that will stop when it reaches a certain level of torque. So it'll only go so far. If I crank it up, now it stops when it gets to the end. So you have 10 or 12 levels of clutch, and where that actually is to your advantage is when we're driving multiple screws, you want all the heads to be at the same height, and you don't want them to draw in too tight, because it actually isn't holding well enough, and you also don't want to strip the pilot hole. The clutch allows you to have repeatability and reliability with how tight you're putting in your screws. So at this point, I would ask if there's any questions, and sometimes I will be the one to ask the questions and ask the students to write down their answers, just to get a bit of a feedback with what they perceive. But in the case of my presentation for the program, LCI, I actually had a bunch of little samples of wood that had already been pre-drilled, and I was just going to hand them out, and a couple of screws and screwdrivers, and people could experience and see and feel what a properly made screw joint was. So there you go. Thanks for your time, and I appreciate you watching. Cheers.